Global Conflicts and Refugees, Part 1. In this first part, I would like to introduce to 4 exemplary conflicts. I would like to initially illustrate the key source of refugees, armed conflicts and wars. I will sketch 4 of such conflicts: the civil wars in Syria and South Sudan, the eviction of Rohingya from Myanmar, and the conflict in Yemen. This first part leads to the question, how do we conceptualize what is going on in these and other countries? The concept of new wars helps to understand some dimensions, so I will briefly introduce you to the concept, apply it to the exemplary conflicts, and open the discussion. So why do we look at Syria, South Sudan, Myanmar, or Yemen? In 2019, there were 24 countries with wars or armed conflicts. But Syria stands out as it is, since 2014, the country with the highest number of refugees. In 2020, the conflict is in its 10th year and there is no end in sight. South Sudan is the world's youngest nation. It was established in 2011 and in spring 2017 became the country with the fastest growing refugee crisis. Myanmar, at the end of 2017 and still ongoing in 2019, the persecution and eviction of Rohingya from Myanmar became the fastest growing crisis. And then Yemen. The UN considers the war in Yemen the greatest ongoing humanitarian disaster. So with regard to Syria, let's have a look at the Syrian Civil War Map 2019. The colorful map requires a legend. And what the map reflects is that the country is split among a number of war parties. And we'll have a look at these on the next slide. So this is a list of the main factions currently involved in the Syrian civil war. They are numerous and coalitions may also change. In the order they are listed here. So the first 3 are the anti-government groupings consisting, depending on the situation, of the Secular National Liberation Front, of US-backed rebels, of Turkish-backed jihadists, and the Islamic extremists of Hayat Tahrir al-Shams. The next one, this purple or blue marked little square, Syria's Golan Heights are still occupied by Israel. Then we have the Sotoro, who are a regional Christian militia supporting the Assad regime. The NDF, the National Defense Forces, is also a pro-government militia. The Sutoro, as opposed to the Sotoro, is an Syriac Christian police force. The Asayish are a Kurdish police force and opposing the government. The Syrian Arab Army, which is the next one, is the Syrian military forces of the Assad regime, fighting the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, which are an alliance of Kurdish, Arab, Assyrian, and other militias that started primarily fighting the Islamic State. The YPG, in combination with the Syrian Democratic Forces, is a mainly Kurdish militia. It founded the SDF, mentioned earlier, as an umbrella group to better incorporate Arabs and minorities. And then there is the Syrian government, the Syrian Arab Army and its allies, and last but not least, on the last line here, the Turkish army supporting jihadist forces. Now let's try to understand the map some more. So the red or pink area here is this controlled now again by the Syrian government, so the Syrian Arab Army and its allies. In the north, there is a Kurdish-led autonomous administration of North and East Syria. Then there is areas, these here that are somewhat orange or brownish, that's where the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian Arab Army fight against each other to gain control. Then there is in the south an area controlled by US-backed rebels who are also anti-government. Another anti-government group is controlling this area in the north. That's the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the National Liberation Front and other Turkish-backed jihadists. On top of that, the turquoise area is where the Turkish army and jihadist forces are in control. And again, last but not least, the Golan Heights of Syria are under Israeli control. So let's have a look who fights whom in Syria.
Was 2011 mit einem Aufstand angefangen hat, hat sich schnell zu einem Krieg mit vielen Akteuren entwickelt. Wer kämpft eigentlich in Syrien? Zunächst ist da der Konflikt zwischen den syrischen Regierungstruppen von Präsident Assad auf der einen Seite und den bewaffneten Oppositionellen auf der anderen Seite. Inzwischen sind das zig verschiedene Gruppen, die meisten islamistisch oder sogar terroristisch. Die Terrormiliz Islamischer Staat verliert derzeit an Einfluss. Aus dem Ausland mischen verschiedene Akteure mit. Die Assad-Unterstützer sind klar zu benennen: Russland, Iran und die libanesische Hisbollah-Miliz, die vom Iran unterstützt wird. Russland ist traditionell Verbündeter Syriens, unterhält dort Luftwaffenstützpunkte und eine Marinebasis. Russland geht es um militärischen und politischen Einfluss in der Region. Den will auch der Iran und unterstützt die Assad-Regierung mit Bodentruppen. Der Iran kann sich so über Syrien auch einen Zugang zum Mittelmeer verschaffen. Und zur libanesischen Hisbollah. Die Miliz kämpft ebenfalls an der Seite Assads in Syrien. Die Front der Gegner des syrischen Regimes ist unübersichtlicher. Sie alle sind nicht einfach nur gegen Assad, auch sie haben ihre eigenen Interessen. Die USA haben gemeinsam mit einigen anderen Ländern, unter ihnen auch Deutschland, den Kampf gegen die IS-Terrormiliz in den Vordergrund gestellt. Die USA haben deshalb auch kurdische Milizen in Syrien unterstützt, unter anderem auch die YPG. Genau die bekämpft die Türkei im Norden Syriens an der Grenzregion. Die Türkei will verhindern, dass die Kurden Nordsyrien kontrollieren. Saudi-Arabien und Katar unterstützen unterschiedliche Gruppen der bewaffneten Opposition, versuchen so, mehr Einfluss in der Region zu gewinnen. Außerdem greift Israel zunehmend militärisch in Syrien ein, will dort den wachsenden Einfluss seines Erzfeindes Iran begrenzen. Viele Akteure, viele Interessen, politisch, wirtschaftlich. Leidtragende sind vor allem die Zivilisten in Syrien. Mindestens 11 Millionen Menschen sind auf der Flucht, über die Hälfte innerhalb des Landes. Und bislang sind mindestens 400.000 Menschen gestorben.
So, as described in the video, the civil war in Syria is also driven by external actors who capitalize on the humanitarian disaster. This strategy might also be described as weapons of mass migration. At the end of January 2020, the UN stated that since December 2019, approximately 520,000 people fled from the province Idlib. The Assad forces tried to regain control of the province which is controlled by jihadist forces backed by Turkey. Turkey has opened its borders for refugees who want to go to Europe, and it also opened its borders to Greece and Bulgaria. So let's move on to South Sudan. In 2011, after Africa's longest-run civil war, South Sudan gains independence from the north. South Sudan, with a population of approximately 11 million people, is home to over 60 different major ethnic groups. So here's a map of the country. The country is very much dominated by the Nile, running through it from the south to the north. South Sudan is primarily a rural country, and also major parts of it are desert-like. The country is extremely poor. Its ranking is 187 of 189 states in the Human Development Index. 98% of the state revenue is from oil. In 2013, civil war breaks out after the president, Salva Kiir, sacks the cabinet and accuses Vice President Riek Machar of planning a failed coup. Both Kiir and Machar had been leading militias that were fighting the Sudanese central government before South Sudan became independent. Over 2.2 million people are displaced by the fighting. In 2017, when the fighting is still going on, a famine is declared in parts of South Sudan in what the UN describes as a man-made catastrophe caused by civil war and economic collapse. In August 2017, the number of refugees fleeing violence to Uganda passes the 1 million mark. In August 2019, the war seems to end. President Kiir signs a power-sharing agreement with Riek Machar and other opposition groups in a bid to end the civil war. The deal will see Machar return to government as one of 5 vice presidents. At this point, more than 2 million people have died, and more than 4 million are internally displaced persons or became refugees as a result of a civil war, as mentioned, in a country of 11 million people. In 2018, the war might have officially ended, but in 2020, the situation is still dire. There is evidence of violations and illicit concealment of arms. So Amnesty International visited 12 military camps in South Sudan, and those visits, as well as satellite imagery, reveal multiple forces violating the arms embargo. There's child soldiers, there's illicit concealment and diversion of arms. So there's no celebrations. Well, it's not time for celebrations just yet. The UN reports come to the results. The guns may have largely fallen silent, but until reforms agreed by the parties are implemented, including of the security sector, it would be premature to celebrate a conclusive end to violence and human rights violations in South Sudan. The situation in Myanmar, also in 2020, is still dire. Here, the conflict started in 2017.
There are thousands of refugees entering Bangladesh every day. They cross the border of Myanmar, where the state military has launched a violent offensive against an ethnic minority group, the Rohingya. The UN reported that since August 2017, about 400,000 Rohingya men, women, and children have fled their homes in Myanmar's Rakhine state. Reports claim that the military has been killing and raping the Rohingya, and has set their villages on fire. Satellite imagery showing burned villages confirms those reports.
Because Myanmar has refused access to human rights investigators, the current situation cannot yet be fully assessed, but the situation remains or seems a textbook example of ethnic cleansing.
The term ethnic cleansing has been reserved for some of the worst atrocities in history. The UN defines it as a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. What makes Myanmar a textbook example is that the military has been launching attacks on the Rohingya, a Muslim minority in a majority Buddhist country. Violent tactics have forced tens of thousands of Rohingya to flee their homes. While many fled to Malaysia and Thailand, most ended up in Bangladesh. The recent wave of violence is the latest in a pattern of discrimination that started over 50 years ago. In 1962, Myanmar, then called Burma, was taken over by the military in a coup. They got rid of the country's constitution and created a military junta. Like many dictatorships, they promoted fierce nationalism based on the country's Buddhist identity. And when they needed a common enemy to help unite the population, the Rohingya were singled out as a threat. Tensions between the Burmese Buddhist population and the Rohingya go back to the Second World War, when each group supported opposing sides. The Rohingya sided with the British colonialists, who ruled the country, and the Buddhists mostly sided with the Japanese invaders, hoping they'd help end the British rule after the war. But even in modern Myanmar, the Rohingya minority continue to be an easy target. Although their lineage can be traced back to 15th century Burma, the government has been forcing them out, claiming they're illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. It started in 1978 after a massive crackdown called Operation Dragon King forced about 200,000 Rohingya to flee to Bangladesh. The military reportedly used violence and rape to drive them out. About 170,000 Rohingya reportedly returned to Burma. Then in 1982, the government passed the Citizenship Act, recognizing 135 ethnic groups. The Rohingya, with a population of about 1 million, were not on the list and became a stateless people. In 1991, Myanmar's military launched another campaign, literally called Operation Clean and Beautiful Nation. This time, about 250,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh. Tensions continued to build against the Rohingya in the 2000s. Violence broke out in 2012 when 4 Muslim men were accused of raping and killing a Buddhist woman in Rakhine. Buddhist nationalists backed by security forces attacked Muslim neighborhoods, burned homes, displacing tens of thousands of Rohingya again. Human Rights Watch deemed it an ethnic cleansing campaign. By this point, the Rohingya were persecuted, disenfranchised, and stateless. In 2016, a Rohingya militant group, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, emerged and coordinated small-scale attacks on border police stations. An attack on August 25, 2017, left 12 police officers dead and sparked the current crisis against Rohingya civilians. A brutal retaliation by the state security forces has led to about 400 deaths and the mass exodus of about 400,000 Rohingya to Bangladesh. Since the August attack, 210 villages have been burned to the ground. The violent campaign has triggered the fastest growing humanitarian crisis in recent years. But Myanmar's de facto leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Aung San Suu Kyi, has barely acknowledged the attacks.
More than 50% of the villages of Muslims are intact. They are as they were before the attacks took place.
When she says that, 50% of the Muslim villages are still present in Rakhine State, well, what are we talking about? 50% are gone. 50% are burnt out. In any school I went to, 50% is a failing grade.
Recent reports claim that the military has planted landmines along the Bangladesh border to prevent the Rohingya from returning. Myanmar's government has systematically driven the Rohingya out of the country. Over the last 5 decades, it has stripped their citizenship, terrorized them, and destroyed their homes. And now, it wants to keep them from ever coming back.
The video documented the situation in September 2017. In early 2020, there is more than 500,000 Rohingya believed to be still living in Myanmar's northern Rakhine province. UN investigators have warned there is a serious risk that genocidal action may occur or recur. The situation that led to killings, rapes, and gang rapes, torture, forced displacement, and other grave rights violations in 2017 remained unchanged, the investigators said in September. Yeah, the situation in Yemen. Until 1990, Yemen consisted of two states. In the north, the Presidential Republic had been established in 1968, after a civil war starting in 1962, when the monarchy was overthrown at the death of the ruling imam. The Saidi, a variation of the Shiite imamate, had been ruling since the 9th century. In the 1980s, in the area linked to the Zaidi sect and the imamate, the Houthi political and military movement started, opposing the government in Sana'a. The south of Yemen, which had been a British colony, became a socialist state in 1967. After the end of the communist bloc, North and South Yemen united in 1990. After protests against the presidential regime in the Arab Spring, the Houthi movement seized power in Sana'a. The president weakened because of a separate movement in the south, the continuing loyalty of security personnel to his predecessor, as well as corruption, unemployment, and food insecurity. Alarmed by the rise of the Houthis, believed to be backed by Iran, Saudi Arabia and 8 other mostly Sunni Arab states began an air campaign in 2015. The coalition had support from the US, the UK, and France. In 2020, the war is still raging. The direct actors include Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the Houthis, the Southern Transitional Council, and the exiled president and his government. This map shows the current situation in Yemen. The purple area is the part of the country controlled by the Al-Houthis, or they are also called Ansar Allah, the helpers or supporters of God. The green part is controlled by the Saudi-led forces. Major sections in the east, this gray-brown area, is controlled by or dominated by Al-Qaeda. The movement had a basis in Yemen early on, at least since the year 2000. Then there is also pockets of Yemen that are controlled by ISIS. And and then what is not visible on this map, but also very clearly the case, is that the Southern Transitional Council, the separatist movement of the South, is also controlling areas, including the city of Aden. The war is also partly a war with the US. Here is a graph and also a map of the US drone strikes in Yemen, which reached their peak in 2017, but also went on in 2018 and 2019. They had started early on in 29. Overall, there is a huge number of civilian deaths in Yemen, and 60% of those civilian deaths have been the result of Saudi-led airstrikes. Overall, the scale of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, there is a population of 27 million people. 2 million are internally displaced people, but even more, are considered food insecure. That's actually more than half of the population, 17 million. And also half of the population is without access to safe drinking water or sanitation, which has, for example, led to major outbreaks of cholera in Yemen in the 21st century. So after this glance at four major ongoing conflicts, I would like to move to conceptualizing them in a way. And I do think that the idea of old and new wars is an appropriate way to do so. So, what are old or classical wars? Herfried Münkler, but also Mary Kaldor, conceptualize these as symmetrical wars, so they are taking place between states, between nation states. And the actors are soldiers or militaries, armies. As the wars are part of the state monopoly on violence in the 19th or 20th century at least. And especially in the 20th century, there is also an international legal framework for the wars. And there is a distinct status. Either countries are at war with each other, or there is peace, or maybe a truce in between, but leading either back to war or leading to peace. So what are new wars as compared to those classical wars? So a first indicator is that they are linked to fragile or failing states. So one might think that a classical war is something that has something to do with the strength of a state, who can buy arms, can have a strong military and all that. New wars are an indicator of the opposite, of fragile or failing states. And then new wars are also very closely connected to a deteriorating state monopoly on violence, or a state monopoly of violence that was never clearly established. And as a consequence, there is very frequently paramilitary organizations as key actors in such wars. So it is not one national army fighting another national army, but various paramilitary groups that to some extent are linked to another nation, or to the nation where the conflict takes place, but that have their own structure, economy, agenda. New wars are also characterized by a predominance of civil victims. So until the First World War, that's when it also changed for the classical wars, wars were characterized by having the main victims being soldiers. As they were fighting each other, they would also be wounded or die as a consequence. So since the First World War, this has changed to quite an extent, and but it is also a characteristic of the new wars that there is predominantly civil victims. Also connected with the new wars is an emergence of economies of violence and warfare. This is part of a shadow globalization. So new wars are often led at a low technology level. There is a number of cheap arms that can be bought on the global market. For example, landmines belong to this category. And in these economies of violence and warfare, the business is to sell and to buy arms, but then it's also about buying massive numbers of cheap arms that can lead to major destruction, and then on the other hand also of gains in terms of commodities, of raw materials, and so on. So emergence of economies of violence and warfare is one dimension of new wars. And then last, but by far not least, an objective of the new wars is identity politics. So who belongs to the nation, who is allowed to appropriate resources, and so on. So I would then like to apply the concept of the new wars to those conflicts we've been looking at. One element of new wars is the asymmetry. In Yemen, the richest Arab state is fighting the poorest. Famine and disease are used as weapons to secure dominance in the region, Saudi Arabia versus Iran. There's also US drone strikes, meaning high-tech warfare in a poverty-stricken country. In Myanmar, the military is prosecuting and evicting Rohingya civilians. So in both cases, it is not equal opponents fighting each other, but a clear hierarchy. The next dimension of new wars, deteriorated state monopoly on violence and paramilitary organization. In Yemen, the state monopoly on violence was never established. The Houthis became an armed militia in the early 2000s. Al-Qaeda controlled villages in Yemen as early as the year 2000. In South Sudan, the military groups fighting for secession from the north a few years later started to fight each other in a civil war. In Syria, the violently suppressed Arab Spring protests escalated to an armed conflict. The next dimension of new wars, civil victims and arbitrariness. In all four exemplary conflicts, the majority of victims are civilians or non-combatants. Just as an example, the UN recorded 13,000 civilian casualties in Yemen, including 4,700 killed between the 26th of March, when the coalition air campaign began, and the 26th of March in 2017. Or what can also be said with regard to the war in Yemen. Meanwhile, the war grinds on, and it is the civilians of Yemen that bear the brunt of the geopolitical games being played by those around it. Another element of the new wars is the economies of violence, the appropriation of resources, and also identity politics. The personal and ethnic distribution of resources, especially the oil fields or the income from the oil in South Sudan, is a key trigger of the civil war. In Myanmar, it's ethnic cleansing, so this identity politics about a Buddhist nation. In Yemen, it is about Wahhabi or Sunni Islam, the Saudi version of Islam, versus the Zaidi or Shia Islam, the Zaidi of Yemen and the Shia big brother in Iran, and also the secular government in Yemen. And in Syria, it is again the control of oil fields in the Kurdish region. So I would end the presentation or interrupt the presentation here in order to discuss the concept of old and new wars, and we should look at questions. Are these Eurocentric concepts? What do they really explain? What alternative ways of explaining the situation are there? Thank you.